And George Bush Sr. said, by God, we kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. We're back, baby. Now we can have wars again. In the end, they trapped him into it. They basically encouraged the Kuwaitis to give him the stiff arm, right? And encouraged him to go ahead and get his revenge and take the northern oil fields.
Scott Horton was recently on Tucker Carlson's podcast explaining what an utter disaster the first Iraq War was and how the U.S. government actually orchestrated it, a fact that many Americans don't know. He also talks about what the purpose behind the war machine was in encouraging this war. Scott's a brilliant military history mind and a foreign policy mind, so let's see what he has to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
So then we get to Iraq War I. Desert Storm, Operation Yellow Ribbon, right? So what's going on here is the Iraqis have just fought a war on behalf of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, basically, to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now Saddam owes them billions in war debts, but he can't pay them because oil's trading at, I think, $12 a barrel. He can't rebuild his country and he can't pay off his war debts. And they're calling in their loans and they're being real hard asses about it. And so he's threatening, essentially, through body language, he's moving his troops toward the Kuwaiti border and threatening to solve it the hard way. Now, I do not believe that this was on purpose. As I explain in the book, the best I can tell, this is a lot of left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Too many government departments, too many different people calling shots in different places. There is no real one mind running the government, right? It's a bunch of different guys in different fiefdoms. So in this case, CENTCOM and CIA were telling, which brand new CENTCOM, which is just being established, we're telling the Kuwaitis that you don't have to take that stuff from Saddam Hussein. Tell him to go to hell, basically. The State Department, led by James Baker, and not just April Glaspie in the meeting on July 25th, but also a statement by Margaret Tutwiler and another by...
That'd be Jim Baker's assistant spokeswoman.
Yes. And then... I'm sorry, I forget the other guy's name, but it was the ambassador, April Glaspie, Margaret Tutwiler, and this other guy in testimony before the Congress. Had all three essentially given a green light to Saddam Hussein, or at worst, like a flashing yellow light to go ahead and proceed.
Just imagine that this whole war was sparked over the idea that Saddam Hussein was a new Hitler that was going to take over the Middle East. He's invading this poor and, relatively defenseless country in Kuwait to, monopolize the oil fields and, establish a new caliphate. There was all sorts of absurd propaganda from this time. And here you have different actors within the U.S. government encouraging this, not only on the side of Kuwait with the CIA and the State Department greenlighting Saddam's invasion. Saddam was, at this point, a friend of the United States, tied in close relations with the United States. The United States gave him immense amounts of money to invade Iran. That was a catastrophic war that cost about 1 million lives. And Saddam was on good terms mostly. Now, there were times in which, the Iran-Contra deal did fund the other side of that war to some extent, Iran. But, Saddam was influenced by the U.S. government to attack. And the reasons for this, I think, will become clear when you think about how foreign policy turned out after that in the U.S.
As Glaspie told him, I used to be the ambassador to Kuwait, and it was the same thing then. This is not our concern. Your border dispute with Kuwait is not our concern. She said, we don't want to see a war here. But Hussein wasn't planning a war. He was planning to roll right in there, right? He could take Kuwait in a day, and he did. And so it seemed like what she was saying was, we won't attack you if you attack. And Stephen Walt wrote at foreignpolicy.com. He has a blog there where he addressed the Glaspie memo, because we always had the Iraqis version of it. But then thanks to Manning and Assange, we finally got our hands on the State Department's version of the same document. And so Stephen Walt gave a thorough treatment on, boy, it sure looks like a flashing yellow light to me. Now, at the same time, though, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy Paul Wolfowitz were alarmed. And they wanted to warn Saddam Hussein not to do it. And they made a statement telling him not to do it. But then Pete Williams, who later became the NBC reporter, he was the spokesman for the Pentagon, and he walked back their warning and made it seem like actually maybe you can go ahead. And I don't know if that was deliberate or just incompetence on his part.
There seem to be few things in terms of Washington and the deep state and Washington foreign policy that are coincidences, to be honest. But Scott's incredibly knowledgeable about this. And, he has a very staunch anti-war position, but he's being as charitable as you can possibly be as a dissident talking about this and seeing how ludicrous this was, that this was orchestrated by the U.S. government for particular purposes, and that was to advance the war machine.
But then, so they tried, Cheney and Wolfowitz got George Bush to send a letter, but the letter was too softly worded. So they were like, no, we need to send another letter with a more stern warning so Hussein really gets the message. But by then it was too late and the troops rolled across the border. So they really, in essence, like figuratively, in the end, they trapped him into it. They basically encouraged the Kuwaitis to give him the stiff arm, right? And encouraged him to go ahead and get his revenge and take the northern oil fields. And then their warnings, actually, when they changed their mind and tried to get him to stop, were not enough to dissuade him.
This is entrapment, classic entrapment, and we see it outside of the realm of foreign policy, too. It was entrapment when the FBI essentially recruited people to engage in what was a failed experiment in an attempt to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. It was entrapment when clearly there seemed to be people on January 6th that were feds or encouraging that behavior to set up this scheme and give the government, justification to create this absurd insurrection narrative, most unarmed insurrection we've ever seen. But this happens in foreign policy too. Scott's exactly right. This started the U.S. down a train of empire building that hadn't completely existed before that time. And don't get me wrong, this last century has been the century of American war, but since then it's spiraled out of control. So what this war did, the first Gulf War in 91, was shake the U.S. loose from the idea that the U.S. couldn't fight wars anymore, because the previous few wars that the U.S. fought were either disastrous or quasi-disastrous, like Vietnam and Korea. This Vietnam syndrome was the word that they used to describe it, like this sensibility among Americans that we shouldn't engage in these wars anymore. And of course, all the neocons and warlords and sinister forces trying to, get the U.S. back on a track to empire building encourage this every single time. And that's what you saw throughout all of this.
And April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Kuwait, told the New York Times, we didn't think he was going to take the whole country. He was supposed to just take the northern oil fields, but instead he went too far and took the whole country. But then Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, and I believe he was the one who chaired the National Security Council meeting where they all decided they're just going to draw the line at Saudi Arabia. They're not even going to threaten to attack Iraq over Kuwait. We don't like it, but we're prepared to accept it. And that held for 3 days until Margaret Thatcher came to town. And Margaret Thatcher essentially called Bush a wimp and said, don't you go wobbly on me now, Bush. And that became a big scandal because she's a woman and she's calling out his manhood. And he had already been called a wimp president. That was like the cover of Newsweek. It's the famous Bill Hicks joke. Cover of Newsweek, wimp president. And he had to somehow get over that. So
yeah, this mentality that you're only strong if you engage in fruitless foreign wars is something that still taints the U.S. establishment, the political establishment today. If you want to engage in peace and diplomacy, you're always called a charlatan or a traitor or a secret collaborator with the enemy. How many times have you heard if you disagree with funding Ukraine that you're just spreading Putin propaganda? Or if you disagree with the genocide in Gaza or Israel's war in Iran, you're just an anti-Semite. That's what they do. This is the playbook that they always use. Ironically, some of the greatest success stories in the U.S. exuding strength in the most beneficial way for the country has been through diplomatic endeavors. Just a few examples. The Louisiana Purchase, securing just an immeasurable amount of territory for $15 million back then, stretched to the maximum degree to the benefit of so many people. And yeah, there's problems with it. Indians were pushed off their land and things like that. But the U.S. didn't go to war over that with European powers. They engaged with Napoleon diplomatically under the Jefferson administration. Robert Livingston played a role in that and secured that. Another example, the brilliant Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who I don't think was a good president, but he was a brilliant Secretary of State. He secured the purchase of Spain, not by going to war with Spain, But by saying, hey, Andrew Jackson, against our orders, invaded Spain, and the ease at which he did it makes it kind of conducive for you to sell this to us. Why don't you sell this to us? And they did. That is strength. That's strength in diplomacy. It's weak to get embroiled in these stupid foreign wars.
That was when he said, oh, this will not stand and all that. Well, the British had investments in Kuwaiti oil and the Kuwaitis had investments in British debt. But what's that got to do with you and me, Tucker Carlson? I mean, we declared independence from the British Empire a long time ago, I heard.
So, yeah.
But no. And so they went to run this errand essentially for the Brits to reinstall. And I remember, and I was very interested in this. I was ninth grade at the time, very interested in the war. I don't remember the words, His Royal Highness King Al-Jaber, being mentioned once on the news. That was what the war was for, to reinstall King Al-Jaber to his throne, right? Like I don't even remember hearing that name a single time during all that. We just must protect the poor Kuwaitis. And of course they lied. And they pretended that Saddam was lining up his tanks on the Saudi border and was prepared to invade Saudi Arabia, which was a total hoax, never happened. And the St. Petersburg, Florida Times got Soviet satellite pictures that showed nothing but empty desert out there. And I've known guys who were stationed there said, yeah, they came and tested the border a little bit and left, but there never was mechanized divisions lined up prepared to invade on Riyadh. All they had to do was warn Hussein, you better not go to Riyadh, pal, or you're going to deal with us. He wasn't ever going to go.
Yeah, this was part of the war propaganda campaign that appears so often to drag the U.S. into these things, drum up this new threat, this new CIA boogeyman, as if he's the next Hitler. They're all the next Hitler. Noriega was Hitler. Putin is Hitler now in the mainstream consensus. They did this with Saddam Hussein, with Assad, with Gaddafi. They always do it. That's always the likening point, because then it makes you Neville Chamberlain if you happen to disagree with going to war over that situation when it doesn't benefit America at all. It's the typical scheme, and it's amazing that it still works in some people's eyes.
And then they lied about the atrocities, and the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States lied before the Congress and said that she was a nurse at the hospital in Kuwait City and saw Iraqi soldiers dump premature babies out of the incubators and leave them on the cold floor to die, she said, and steal their incubators. And George Bush and the PR people repeated this, senior that is, and the PR people repeated this numerous times as example of why we absolutely had to intervene for humanitarian reasons to save the poor Kuwaitis. Total hoax. She was not a nurse and she wasn't even in the country at the time of the invasion. It was all just a made up lie, but it was good enough to create the moral outrage in the country to get people to support the war.
Yeah, it reminds me of recent propaganda in Israel that, Hamas beheaded all these babies, and that story got a lot of headway in mainstream news to encourage Americans to dump all of our treasury into Israel, whatever's left of it, which is nothing. We're $37 trillion in debt. But this is the war propaganda that's being used. So, regardless of how barbaric Hamas is, and they're terrorists, this is drummed up to make it more likely for Americans to support these nonsensical wars.
Now, the reason I dwell on this is because mostly people look at Iraq War I as this huge success. It's a 100-hour land war. We got to showcase all our laser-guided munitions flying down chimneys and in windows and all of this like brand new space-age 21st century technology. And it was just short and sweet. We lost less than 100 guys or less than 200 guys, depending on how you count them, from various accidents and whatever. And so it was just it was just wonderful at the time. It was Operation Yellow Ribbon. And George Bush Sr. said, by God, we kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. We're back, baby. Now we can have wars again. And in fact, Brent Scowcroft did say specifically that this was one of the reasons that they wanted to have the war.
Imagine that. That is just so telling, that this is what disrupted the narrative that the U.S. couldn't fight wars again. And it makes sense given what we've seen in hindsight in the last 24 years. It's just been war after war after war after war. And it's so sad that this was the reason. Americans were duped into supporting this war just to show Americans that, hey, it could be successful. Well, was Iraq a success? The U.S. bombed Iraq for 30 years, essentially. It dumped billions of dollars into it. Thousands of Americans died there. About 1 million Iraqis died there. It disrupted the global economy, plunged the U.S. into debt, and now Islamic fundamentalists that are not secular control Iraq. And ISIS controlled it for a time too. That's where we're at here. This was not a success. And that is why they always celebrate wars at the beginning. And then it turns out to be beyond the pale, wrong, and fraught with error, just like Afghanistan, too.
Was to beat Vietnam syndrome, to give the American people a cheap and quick and easy win on the Powell Doctrine, in and out, kick their butt and get out of there quickly and call it a victory and get the American people to mix their patriotism with militarism again, like the good old days. And it worked. It was explicitly one of their goals. And yet there's a huge, which is the Shiite and Kurdish uprising that took place about 6 weeks later after the end of the war. Bush Sr. personally, in a radio message over Voice of America, and the Air Force dropped leaflets over the Shiite army divisions in the south of the country, which America occupied the entire south of Iraq in the aftermath of the war. And they encouraged all of these Shiites to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And they did. They took him up on it. People in your audience, I know you're not a big electronic media guy, but people in your audience may have seen the movie Three Kings with Ice Cube and Marky Mark and George Clooney. And in that movie, the setting, it's a gold heist movie, but the setting is they're occupying southern Iraq in the aftermath of the war. And all around them, the Iraqi army is putting down the Shiite insurrection, crushing the insurrection and killing all these poor people and driving the refugees into Iran. So that's kind of a touchstone for people. If that's probably the best way they would ever remember that such a thing ever happened, is that movie. Popularized it a little bit. But so what happened was they were on their way to Baghdad, but George Bush and his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, Secretary of State Baker, Secretary of Defense Cheney, they changed their mind. And they left the Shiites high and dry, and they let Saddam Hussein keep his helicopters and tanks to crush the revolution. Why? It was because, remember when I said, when the Iranian Revolution happened, some of these Iraqi Shiites went to Iran and sided with the Iranians and wanted to import the revolution into Iraq. And that was why Saddam conscripted them all to fight the war, right? Because that was what he was afraid of. Well, they started coming back across the border from Iran, namely the Badr Brigade, which was the armed militia of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was a group of Iraqis tied very closely to the Dawa Party who were supported by Iran and had been living in Iran for the last 10 years. And had fought on Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq War.
You know what the ultimate irony here is, that after Iraq fell, what happened was exactly what Saudi Arabia feared, and why Saudi Arabia opposed that war so strongly. It's that Iranian influence spilled into Iraq. It caused, a Shiite revolution to kind of finally culminate and fundamentalists to take over. So all this is just so ironic in hindsight.
Now they're coming across the border to lead the revolution. So this is the Bush Senior administration. These are all the Reaganites, right? This is Ronald Reagan's vice president and all of his men. Dick Cheney was the only new guy. He had come from the House. All of the rest of them had been Reagan administration officials. So they're all saying to themselves, oh my God, we just spent 9 years, supporting Saddam Hussein's war against Iran to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now we're importing it. We're going to be the ones to put it in power in Baghdad. Oops. So they called it off, and they let Saddam Hussein massacre 100,000 people or so in order to crush that insurrection and stay in power.
That's what happened, but, the ultimate irony, again, is that they did spill over, after Saddam's regime fell, the failed U.S. occupation, which, was sold as a stunning success. We had mission accomplished, that banner, after, the second Iraq war. But if you were to tell me a juncture at which the United States went from being, a militaristic superpower, which they certainly were since the Wilsonian era, to being true empire builders, it might be 1991. It might be the first Gulf War, Operation Yellow Ribbon. It might be all of this situation, because after that, Americans were willing to be duped. Not willing, they were, duplicitously led in that direction by treacherous government, actors in the deep state, complicit news media, where they didn't have this independent, dissident media back then, where, the few voices that, were available were mostly all in support of all this stuff, the uniparty supporting it, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about. That was who was calling the shots. And, You know, that's one of the reasons I'm more optimistic now about where the culture is heading and how that might influence politics, is because we get to see the other side now. Some of this is exposed, documents are disseminated on the internet, and we have people like Scott Horton bringing these things to light so many Americans can see it for the first time. So yeah, I think empire building largely began in 1991. It was after that point that Americans were willing to engage in reckless regime change policies again. Now, again, that had happened even as early as the 1950s. We had Cuba and Guatemala, and later the Bay of Pigs fiasco. But Americans were now willing to buy into this regime nonsense because of how successful the U.S. was in the first Gulf War, which was an absolute disaster. Not in terms of the men lost in the first one. Obviously, one is too much for this ludicrous intervention because of a slant drilling dispute that the U.S. encouraged anyways, but because of what the ramifications were and the precedent that this set for wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria and Yemen and Ukraine and what have you, all the experimental nonsense that the U.S. engages in now. But I do want to hear from what you guys say. Let me know down below, is Scott right about the first Gulf War? Is 1991 the year in which the U.S. became an empire-building nation, an empire-building state? Is this really when the war machine began in the U.S.? Let me know down in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Tucker too. He's awesome, great guest. Love to see Scott Horton, who's a personal friend of mine, on the show. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. You'll support my channel if you do that, and you'll get advanced viewing of all of my videos on YouTube before they're out for the general public, and I'd really appreciate that kind of support. Until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.